Hi guys, so today's video is going to be my Poppy War book chat. If you're looking for a non-spoiler review of this, I did make one of those. This is a book chat though, so I'm going to very much be getting into spoilers. Alrighty, so I kind of have a lot to say about this book. This was this last month's buddy read, so I know a lot of you have a lot of opinions about the book as well. So the first thing I want to talk about is just the character of Rin from the very, very beginning. I really was connected with her. I was really rooting for her. I thought the author did an amazing job of very quickly making you want her to succeed. And Rin's willingness to do anything she could to get out of that situation and to try and better herself and have a better life for herself, I was so on board with. I do think that her personality started to bug me a little bit in some places, which isn't necessarily a negative thing because I appreciate when a character is very much a prominent personality. Something that I didn't love with her was that she didn't really seem to ever show respect to the elders, if you will. When she's learning from Shang, he's telling her like, I've cured you at one point when she had a taste of the Phoenix's power, and he's like, you have been enlightened, you know so much now, we can't use these things for war though. And she kind of thinks to herself like, well, I'm just gonna keep learning from him and then I'm gonna go ahead and use the power anyway. I didn't love that aspect of her, that kind of power hungry aspect, but I think it fit with her personality because of the fact that she was so emotionally abused and so powerless growing up that I could see where she would crave that power so she wouldn't ever really feel weak. That said, as the book continued on, she just never really felt like she matured, and the book had years worth of time passing, and it still felt like anytime somebody was her commander or anytime somebody was in a position above her, she never really listened to them. She always had to talk against them. She always had to speak against them. She always had to challenge them. She always had to get her 2 cents in. For the most part though, even though this tendency in her character might have been annoying, I still thought it was somewhat realistic. Her personality was just to constantly kind of be a thorn in people's butts. I always respect in books when even if it annoys me, the character stays true to their personality. I do want to touch on something though that Rin decided to do that pretty much every buddy reading group brought this up. Let's talk about the fact that Rin was like, oh no, lady things are happening to my body. Let's not have lady things happen to my body. If you're 100% clueless as to what I'm talking about her time of the month. But Rin's decision to rid herself of this problem was something a lot of people took issue with. And I can totally see both sides. Some people were like, it totally makes sense. That's like what she would do. And some people really were against it. And part of the reason that I think a lot of people weren't a fan of this is because Rin is supposed to come across as this strong female character, and a lot of times in books recently, in order to be a strong female character, you have to be masculine. And so by getting rid of something that makes you physically, like anatomy wise, something that makes you female, and getting rid of that was really hard for some people because it just seems to feed into the idea that in order to be a strong female, you have to be like a guy. I think a lot of people were also bothered by the fact that this is something this is something girls go through. This is something that girls have to endure. For a lot of girls, this might have been the perfect opportunity to see in a book a strong female character taking on something that girls have to go through, because often when you see strong female characters, they never mention that kind of stuff. They never seem to have to deal with this kind of stuff. And I think a lot of people were really excited that something that girls go through was actually being presented. And then as soon as it was presented, it was immediately dealt with. I did lean more towards it seemed like something Rin would do. It totally seemed like something she would do. I totally understand the other side of it, and I do want to touch on something that I disliked about it in general. Actually, there were a couple things about how this all came up that I didn't love, and so I'll get into a few of those. One would be that Rin, she studied so much to get into this school, and it's not like she just studied military. I mean, it talked about in the first chunk of the book that she had to study so many different things, and it seemed a teensy bit unrealistic to me that in all of her reading and in all of her memorization and all of her accounts of people in history, it never once came up that every month girls have stuff happen. Okay, so if that's the case, okay, I can accept that, but something that maybe I'm just ignorant to this, and maybe one of you can help me answer this question, but they have this, like, I'm just gonna call it a potion, right? They have this like potion that you take, and it's like, it'll destroy your womb and you never have to deal with that, but you you know, you can't have kids or whatever. And she's like, I don't want kids anyway. So yeah, that sounds good with me. And she takes it. Was there something like that? Because this book is supposed to be essentially historical fiction with fantastical elements put in. And it just kind of seemed like a very, very easy solution. And maybe I'm full of it. And maybe there were things that you could drink that would destroy your womb, and then you'd have 1 week recovery time and you'd be right back at it. But as far as I know, there's not. I don't really know. Like, it just seemed like it was such an easy fix, and that she didn't even have to try to like conquer this thing that every female goes through. If you guys know more about that, fill me in, because I'm curious, was there a magical potion? Let's move along from that though, because that is like one scene in the book, and that obviously is not that significant. Let's just go right into, what is it, chapter 21, the awful grotesque stuff that happens. Let's get into that. I did see that the author wrote a blog entry talking about her decision to really go into detail about just how terrible and violent that scene is, and she didn't want to sugarcoat it. She didn't want to fade to black. She wanted people to understand that those kinds of things have happened in history. She's basing that particular event off of something that did happen in history, and she doesn't want people to be somewhat desensitized. She doesn't want people to read it and just be neutral. She wants people to be disgusted because it's a disgusting thing. For me personally, I don't have problems with authors having that approach whatsoever. However, and this is so hard to talk about without just sounding like I'm bashing the book, but it did feel like at times the book had a tendency to exaggerate. Now, I'm not saying that the extremely violent part was exaggerated, because I know that she's done her research and she's found people that have had accounts of what happened, and I'm not saying that that part was exaggerated, but there were other parts of the book that felt exaggerated. For example, it often talked about when Rin was really pushing herself in her studies, she would just completely stop sleeping altogether. Then when Rin has her first time of the month, it can be really messy for some people, but that scene was described like a murder scene. I mean, it was so intense. And then some of the fight scenes, for instance, the first time, or one of the times that she sees the character Alton fight, that one guy like does that thing where he like twists the stomach or whatever, and everybody was talking about like, oh my gosh, like that's gonna affect his intestines. Alton, I'm pretty sure in that scene, was like coughing up blood or something like that, but then just like gets up and fights, and it's like, there you go. Saying that Rin could meditate without food and without drinking anything for like weeks or however long that she was going through, like that feels really extreme. Rin having to run up the mountain carrying a pig, you know, like at first it's a piglet, and sure, you might be able to carry a piglet, but at some point, like, pigs get enormous. Like, look at how big pigs get. And the reason that I'm bringing these things up is not because I think it's a fault of the book, but I think there's a danger in doing that when you want to accurately portray a really violent scene later, because if so many other scenes up to that point have maybe felt a little exaggerated, then it starts to feel like that's the tendency. There are people that are going to read the book and have no idea that that scene is based off of something that really happened, and they're not going to know that the author did her research and she looked into all that kind of stuff. They're just going to read the book because it's a book being sold at the bookstore. They're going to pick it up and they're going to read it, and they're going to get to that scene and they're going to think like, oh, well, I mean, given some of the other stuff that happened, this is probably not really like, it's just, it feels like it's a shock factor thing. And I really don't want that to be people's reaction to that scene. Okay, well, this is going to sound really terrible, but like, I want people to read that scene and be disgusted by it, because that scene is so awful. That scene is so awful, and I wouldn't want people to discredit it because they feel like maybe there are tendencies to exaggerate in general in the book. Let's get into something a little less serious, because that part is really dark and it's really sad to think about. So let's talk about the way the characters talk. The characters speak very kind of modern and very casually. I'm curious what most of you thought as far as the way the characters spoke. Did it bug you that they spoke maybe more casually? Were you totally for it and you appreciated it? Like, what were your guys' takes on it? I also want to get into something that I feel, once again, is kind of split as to whether people liked it or disliked it, and that would be the pacing. For me, personally, I'm not the biggest fan of a lot of time going by in very few words. For some people, that's fantastic. I think for some people, they so appreciate that because they don't want all those details. They don't want to know all the nonsense. They don't want to see her struggling for a long time. They just want her to get on to the next part. I want to talk about the last, what was it, like 80 pages of the book. So after the really, really terrible, awful, sad things happen, and Alton's like, I'm gonna summon an army of like people who were shamans in the past and have gods in them are like in this mountain now. As soon as I got to that part, a little bit, and I'm a huge fan of fantasy, but when I got to that part, I was like, what? I a little bit felt like the last chunk of the book came out of left field. I really was into what was happening when they were under siege, essentially. I was so into that, and then when they realized it was kind of a trap and a setup and stuff, I was so in, I was 100% in. And then I was thinking like, okay, after all this terrible stuff, like they're gonna get the bad guys is how I'm gonna put it. Like they're gonna make these people pay, like things are gonna go down. And man, when they're in that like that mountain place, I was just, I mean, did I miss something? I felt kind of confused. And I read so many fantasy books, and I would say in general, I usually don't come out of books being like, I don't know what's happening, I'm lost. But it definitely felt like we were at times in the book being given information right before we absolutely needed that information. Find out that Alton had been experimented on. And I was like, oh, that's sad. But there was not that many pages left of the book, so I guess I wasn't expecting that to come into play like immediately. But right after we find out he'd been experimented on is when they go to the mountain, things go south, doesn't work out. They leave, they get captured, and then now he's right back to being experimented on again. And I feel like they got out of that situation because the people that were experimenting on them got them both high, and then in being high, they were able to connect on a spiritual level, and then all of a sudden they did work. And then, you know, when Alton supposedly dies, I don't know if he's actually dead because that other character said he would have felt it, so I'm wondering if Alton's gonna come back in later books. But then Rin, you know, she thinks he's dead, and that her only choice is to go swim to Spearley and go to the temple and summon the phoenix. And she does, and then she like blows up the entire other country with a volcanic eruption. And I guess, you know, like Zhang was warning her like, don't do it, and the Spearley woman in her visions was telling her like, don't do it. And she's like, I don't freaking care. And then she goes and does it anyway, and then yeah, she kills like everybody. What was hard about this for me, I would think she would come out of that being like, oh no, that's not what I wanted. Like I wanted the people who did the terrible things to pay. And I believe there was a line where Rin is saying now she can't differentiate her thoughts between does she really think that this is wrong or does she really think this is right? And if she really thinks this is right, is it actually her thought or is it the phoenix? Is it the phoenix's thought? And now she's not really sure if she even has control over her own mind. But it just felt like in the last few pages of the book, like she gets over that real quick and she goes up, I forget the other guy's name, but the one that was buddies with Alton, she goes up to him and she's like, let's buddy up together and take out that other wind god. And he's like, let's do it. And it just felt kind of, I mean, with the severity of what happened earlier in the book, and then to have that kind of be, I don't know, it just kind of all wrapped up in a way I wasn't expecting. All in all, I don't know that this book was really for me. There was a lot of things about it that I just think weren't up my alley, but I'm not discrediting the book and saying the book is total garbage or anything like that. I'm not saying that, and I feel really bad because since this is a chat and this is one-sided and I wasn't the biggest fan of the book, I definitely feel like it's coming across like I think this book is so bad, and it's not. I don't think that, but I definitely think this book isn't really for me. If you totally loved the book and you thought it was fantastic and you think I'm full of nonsense, then in the comments show your love for the book, because I have the hardest time talking about when I don't love a book because I feel so bad, and I'm sure the author worked so incredibly hard on it. So for me to say like I didn't love it, I feel really awful. So if you loved it, share that. As always, thank you so much for watching. Happy reading to all of you, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye guys.